The notary came to my birthday with a cake knife in his pocket and a document folder under his arm, and I knew something was wrong the moment my daughter-in-law took my house keys from the hook and slipped them into her dress pocket like she was tidying a napkin. My grandson was carrying the candles and my son was pouring kava, yet everyone was watching the man with the silver pen, not the 70 candles that were supposed to be for me. The living room smelled of roast chicken and the lilies that I always buy for myself on my birthday, but all I could feel was the heaviness of the blue folder that the notary placed on my dining table, right on top of the hand-embroidered runner I made in the winter after my husband died. He opened the folder without asking if I wanted to make a wish first, and my daughter-in-law smiled in a way that made my cheeks burn even before I had taken in a single word on the page. "It's just a simplification, Elena," she said, patting the notary's arm like he was an old friend instead of a stranger. "Less paperwork for you, fewer bills, everything streamlined." We talked about it in the family chat, remember? I didn't remember agreeing to anything, and my hands found the chair back, seeking with like a sailor searches for land. She lifted a page that had my name typed in bold letters and a phrase that made my ears ring even though the room was quiet: donation of bear ownership with reservation of usufruct. She liked to dress her orders in soft words, my daughter-in-law, but there is nothing soft about the way she slipped another pen toward me after the first one lay too close to my trembling fingers. "It's standard," the notary murmured, checking his watch. "The same watch my husband would have called fancy and unnecessary. You keep the right to live here. They take care of the taxes and the community fees. Everybody wins." Everybody would win as long as I signed, and I could feel my son's eyes avoiding mine while he fussed with plates, and I could hear the sticky laughter of my neighbors in the courtyard drifting through the open window because on summer nights in our building the walls are thin and words go farther than they should. The notary turned the contract to face me as if I'd misread it upside down, and my daughter-in-law slid the cake toward the edge, ready to make space for my signature where a platter of oranges usually Saturday. "Blow the candles first," Abuela, my grandson said, trying to rescue the moment, his voice too bright, his cheeks flushed, and my throat loosened enough to blow without wishing because I needed air more than luck. I closed my eyes and saw my husband at the kitchen table, his carpenter's hands stained with varnish, counting receipts while I ran numbers in a notebook that I kept even after the shop closed, not because the bank demanded it, but because I believed if you wrote down truth with care it would stand up and defend you when someone tried to talk over it. "I'll read," I said, and my daughter-in-law's smile cracked like a plate left too long in the sink. She adjusted her blouse and sat opposite me as if company could hurry comprehension. She had a way of talking to people as if they were desks in a classroom, one by one and in rows, and she learned which tone opened which drawers. With me she used the voice for tired children, implying patience, promising sweets. With my son she used the voice for ambitious ones, quick, clipped, rewarding. With the notary she used the voice that smoothed invoices, oiled doors, and I watched him relax under it like a chair easing into sunlight. If I was honest, the legal words didn't scare me. Numbers and signatures had been my work for years when I kept books for the carpentry and then later as the volunteer treasurer at the parish pantry. What shook me wasn't the shape of the contract, but the way it had been wrapped like a gift and placed on my table between my lilies and my cake, as if surrender of walls could be folded into a celebration. I read the line about transferring bear ownership to my son and his wife, and I read the clause about community fees paid by the new owners, and I read the paragraph about irrevocability except by significant breach, and I watched my daughter-in-law's breathing quicken when I underlined that part with my nail. "You're overthinking, Mama," my son said finally, his eyes on the tablecloth, on the crumb he couldn't catch. "It's just easier. You won't have to go to the bank anymore. No more dealing with the administrator. No more arguing in those long homeowners' meetings you hate." He wasn't wrong about the meetings. They could stretch, people performing patience until it reveled, voices rising when water bills came or when elevator repairs dragged on. But I also remembered shifting from foot to foot at last month's meeting while the administrator insisted the community fee increase was unavoidable, and I remembered catching him in a calculation that miscategorized the reserve fund, the way his mouth made a fish shape and then closed when I asked for the spreadsheet. My neighbors had laughed and clapped, and I had gone home with a tin of pastries from the woman downstairs because she said someone's grandmother needed to keep them honest. I put the paper down and wiped my fingertip on my skirt, the way I have always done when something leaves a mark, and I noticed the notary's business card tucked in the folder, the edge of it indented slightly as if someone had pressed on it with a pen tip too hard. And I saw a faint smear near my printed name that looked like ink dragged by a left-handed copyist, and I felt the quiet of the room shift from celebratory to expectant the way a theater feels when the curtain lifts and the actors are on stage and no one knows their lines yet. "I thought we were having cake," I said, and my voice came out soft and careful, because that is how you speak when someone is trying to hold your hand to the paper. I turned the page and found a clause I knew would not be in any simple donation because I'd read enough legal texts to recognize when a sentence tries to hide behind legal lace. The donee shall be authorized, in the name and representation of the donor, to manage utilities and communications with service providers, including signing for bank domiciliation changes. "That's for convenience," my daughter-in-law said quickly, too quickly, and her neck flushed above the collar like it does when she forgets to wear sunscreen to the terrace. "You don't like phone menus. You said so. This way we handle it, and you enjoy your soap operas." "I enjoy watching my own hands pay my own bills," I said, and the notary coughed as if a crumb had gone the wrong way even though he hadn't eaten any of my chicken, and my son took a step forward, the little crease between his eyebrows forming. The one I kissed when he was small and angry at puzzles he couldn't solve. "It's not a trap, Mama," he said, his voice low, appealing to the part of me that always wants to make his path smoother. "It's help." He had used that word before when he and his wife talked about moving closer to help, and then when they suggested we simplify, and once when they removed my old armchair because it didn't help the space flow. And I had let it pass because love requires elasticity, or so people say in books, but in real rooms elasticity looks like someone else pulling and counting on you not to count. I looked at my grandson, who had put down the matches and was tracing the edge of a candle with his finger while pretending not to listen. He had that strange honesty teenagers have when they forget to perform, and sometimes he would look at me with a softness that made me think of the little boy who once slipped me a note under my bedroom door that said, in capital letters, "Don't let them sell your blue chair, it's comfy." I cleared my throat and asked the notary if I could keep the draft until tomorrow, because even when a person has counted others' money for years, even when she has balanced budgets in the dark of winter with more precision than many paid clerks, it is good to sleep with a new text, and he glanced at my daughter-in-law before speaking, which told me more than his words would. "The idea was to do it today," he said, small smile, the kind people use when they know they shouldn't be the messenger. "There is a good fiscal window now, and my schedule is tight. But of course, Senora, reading is always wise." "Reading is always wise," I repeated, and my daughter-in-law laughed, a little too bright, as if we were sharing a joke, and the laugh stuck to the ceiling like steam from a pot that's been left boiling. We cut the cake anyway, because the candles had been blown and the sugar had to be eaten, and our fork scraped the plates while the folder sat like a guest who hadn't been invited, but found a chair anyway. I wrapped a slice for the old woman across the hall who had lost her cat last week and still looked at the elevator as if it might open to a meow, and while I pressed plastic wrap over the plate I heard my daughter-in-law whisper to my son. The whisper meant to comfort, the words meant to contain, and I looked out the window where the courtyard grapevine twisted around the metal fence and felt the vines like hands, and I tucked the notary's card under the runner and smiled, because my husband always said when someone hurries you at your own table, you should make them wait in your own way. They left after coffee because my daughter-in-law had a Pilates class and my son had to help carry the food trays down to the car, and the notary closed his folder without ceremony and promised to call in the morning. My grandson lingered at the door, pretending to tie his shoe even though it was already tied, and when his mother turned to the elevator he leaned in and slipped something into my apron pocket, his face pale, his eyes suddenly very old. "Don't tell," he whispered, and then he ran down the hall, his backpack bouncing, and I heard my daughter-in-law say, half joking, half warning, that the boy was always too soft for his own good. And I didn't reach into my pocket until the elevator had side closed and the lights had returned to their plain brightness. It was a receipt from a copy shop across the boulevard. Nothing remarkable except for the name typed in the client field. My name, Elena, in capital letters, and the description. Power of attorney, 12 pages, color copy. The date was 2 days ago, the amount small enough to ignore, the detail precise enough to knot my stomach. I turned it over and found my grandson's scrawl, not in capital letters this time, but in a hurried hand that betrayed his fear and his loyalty at the same time. Mama said you signed at the bank. You didn't. I sat at the table and smoothed the paper on the runner and thought about that Tuesday, 2 days ago, when I had walked to the bank to question the new maintenance fee they had quietly applied to my account without adding any interest to justify it. The clerk had smiled too hard and called me Senora Elena, as if she knew me more intimately than she should, and then she had disappeared to check something on the other system, and I had waited under the glass ceiling watching the pigeons scuffle on the ledge. And when she returned, she asked me to confirm, again, my home phone number, as if updating a field were a courtesy and not a brick in a wall someone else was building around me. I had signed nothing that day except a complaint form about the fee, and I had kept my copy, and I had put it into my blue folder at home, that same folder my husband once used for shop invoices and later for utility receipts. The same folder my daughter-in-law always called old-fashioned, and I stood up and went to my bedroom and pulled it from the wardrobe shelf where I kept it behind the winter sweaters. There are moments when an object weighs more than it should because of what it contains, and as I carried the blue folder back to the table I thought of my husband's hands. He liked to say that wood remembers every tool that touches it, and I wondered if paper remembered pens. I opened the folder and slid out the stack of envelopes and receipts and the bank complaint form, and I realized something small was missing. The copy of my identification that I always keep in the sleeve behind the front cover was not there. I flattened the sleeve and shook it and checked the kitchen drawer where I sometimes kept passport photos, and then I checked the tin box where I kept spare keys and rubber bands and my husband's pocket knife. And when I couldn't find it, I felt the smallest tremor crawl up my forearms the way a train announces itself long before it passes. The doorbell rang, sharp and confident, and I wiped my hands on my apron and went to the intercom. The screen was cloudy because the lens had been smudged by children's fingers and the dust that collects on everything in summer, but I could see enough to make out the shape of a thin woman from our building, the concierge's niece, who sometimes swept the hall when her aunt had a bad back day. She lifted an envelope and pointed to my number. I buzzed the door open, and she came up without losing her breath, even though our stairs are steep, and when I opened my door, she held out the envelope without stepping over the threshold, her eyes flicking down the hallway as if walls had ears. This was in the wrong box, Senora, she said, her voice low, her ponytail damp with heat, your name on the back, but it was stuck in theirs. Theirs? Your son. Or his wife. I can't say who took mail out this morning, but I saw the bundle. She leaned closer, and I could smell her shampoo, the cheap apple one that reminds me of the market stall where I buy fruit, and then she whispered something that made my palms sweat on the paper before I had even turned it over. The stamp is from a notary. My aunt said I should bring it to you myself. I closed the door gently so it wouldn't click, and I walked back to the table, and I set the envelope next to the blue folder, and I looked at my husband's empty chair across from me, and then I slid a fingernail under the flap and lifted it. Careful not to rip, careful because care is a habit and a weapon both when people hope you are careless. Inside the envelope was a single sheet, a bland covering note from a notary office I didn't recognize, and a photocopy of an advance directive form pre-filled with my name, my address, and a paragraph appointing my son as the person authorized to make decisions for me in the event of incapacity. The line for my signature was blank. The line for the witness signatures was not. I stared at the witness names. 2 neighbors whose doors are always shut and who always nod without learning anyone's business, and my ears filled with a rushing noise that I recognized as my own pulse. And I stood and went to the sink and ran cold water over my wrists the way my husband used to tell me to do when I felt a storm coming in my joints. I dried my hands slowly and returned to the table and took a deep breath, the kind that clears a ledger after a mistake, and I looked at the open window and listened to the courtyard where a child was crying because his ball had rolled under a bench. And his mother was talking him down from a ledge of tears with promises that sounded practical and kind, and I thought about promises dressed in soft words. My phone buzzed on the counter, and when I reached it I saw a message in the family chat, a photo of the cake with the caption from my daughter-in-law, "All done simplifying for Mama, new chapter." 3 hearts. My son hadn't typed anything. My grandson had sent a sticker of a cat looking to the side. I felt the old fear bloom, the one that lives behind the ribs of women who have always kept others' calendars and kept their own doubts to themselves. The fear of being seen as inconvenient weight when everyone else wants to move faster. I felt it and I let it settle for a moment so I could see its shape, and then I put it on the table next to the blue folder and the notary letter and the copy shop receipt. And I looked at all 3 as if they were pieces of a puzzle I had solved many times before, just with different pictures on the box. I picked up my landline because sometimes paper wants a voice, and I dialed a number I hadn't used in months, the one printed on the back of the card of a lawyer who once helped the parish pantry with a landlord who thought charity halls should pay commercial rates. He had a slow voice and he listened more than he spoke, which is unusual in his profession, and he had told me once that there are 2 kinds of documents in the world, the ones that are written to inform and the ones that are written to confuse. And you can tell the difference by where the commas go. His assistant answered and took my name, and while I waited on hold listening to tinny music that didn't match the seriousness of my breathing, I opened the drawer where I keep my husband's calculators and the magnifying glass he used when his eyes started to fail. And I laid everything out on the table the way I used to lay out shop invoices at the end of a long month when the sawdust in his hair made tiny moons on our pillow. The lawyer came on the line. He said my name the way people do when they remember the last conversation, and I told him I might be slow, but I was not confused, and that a man with a silver pen had come to my birthday with a gift that wasn't a gift, and that someone in our building had decided I would need help making decisions before I had even had time to forget where I put my own keys, and I heard him shift in his chair even though there was no sound. And he asked me to read him 2 sections of the donation draft and the phrase from the advance directive that made the hairs on my arms stand up, and when I finished he was quiet in the way that means the words have landed. "Come tomorrow morning," he said, "bring everything you have. And Elena, do not sign anything today, no matter what they say." "They said it would make things easier," I whispered, and the whisper didn't sound like mine. It sounded like the voice women use when they pick up their grandchildren even though their backs hurt. "Easier for whom?" He hung up with a promise to send me a list of documents to gather, and I sat with the bird's shadows moving across the wall, and I made tea because my hands needed something to do. And I took my grandson's receipt and placed it between 2 pages of the blue folder as if preserving a leaf that proved a season had changed, and I stood and washed the cake knife and set it to dry, and as I wiped the counter I saw a smear of frosting I had missed, a small curve of white near the edge, almost shaped like a comma. Before I went to bed, I opened the closet where I keep my suitcases and I took out the small one and set it by the door, not because I intended to leave, but because I wanted to remind myself that staying is also a choice. I turned off the kitchen light and the apartment felt larger without voices in it, the kind of large that can feel like freedom or like emptiness depending on the day. And I reached to latch the door and I saw an envelope that had been pushed under it while I stood at the sink. No stamp. No name. Just my address in a brisk, slanted hand I recognized from the notice board in the lobby where someone posts reminders about bicycle storage. Inside was a USB stick taped to a folded note. The note read, in neat printing that carried slightly to the right, as if the writer wanted to outrun his own words, "Cameras see more than people think. Check Tuesday, 11:07. The bank." I did not sleep much because the envelope on the table and the USB in the drawer kept dragging my attention back every time I closed my eyes, so at dawn I made coffee and carried a slice of the birthday cake across the hall to the woman who had lost her cat. And she opened the door in her robe and kissed my cheek and asked how the party went, and I told her there had been a notary at my table and she laughed at first and then stopped when she saw I wasn't trying to be amusing, and she put her hands on the plate and said that young people like to solve problems that don't exist because it gives them practice for the ones that do. And she peered over my shoulder down the hallway and lowered her voice so the concierge's niece would not hear from the stairwell, and told me that she had seen my daughter-in-law whispering to the building administrator yesterday and pointing at the call panel. And when I did not react, she hurried to add that maybe it was nothing and that she might have misread the gesture, and I thanked her and walked back to my apartment, trying not to imagine my name being removed from my own buzzer. I ate a small piece of bread even though my stomach was tight, and I lined up my documents for the lawyer in a transparent folder, and I put the USB in a coin envelope and wrote 1107 across it so I wouldn't forget the note. And then I picked up my landline again and called the bank to ask about Tuesday, and the way the clerk had made me confirm my phone number twice, and the automated voice asked me for digits and dates and then placed me on hold, and while I listened to a melody I do not know the title of, my phone flashed with a call waiting notification from my son, and I ignored it because I knew if I picked up I would lose the bank queue. And when a woman finally answered, she called me Senora Elena with a practiced warmth and then told me that for security she could not give details about customer actions over the phone without verifying a code that would be sent to my mobile. And when she read the last 4 digits of the mobile number on file, I felt a chill because 2 of those digits were not mine, and I asked her to repeat them, and she did, and the number ended in 6 and 8, and mine ends in 3 and 1, and I told her there was a mistake. And she replied that a mobile number update had been recorded on Tuesday at 11 minutes past 11, and that the person who made the change presented a power of attorney valid at the branch. And I asked what name was on the power of attorney, and she hesitated and asked again for the verification I could not receive. And I heard my own voice steady itself without my permission, and I said I was coming in person with identification, and she agreed in the flat tone of a person who suspects a problem but cannot name it on a recorded line. And I put the receiver down with a care that felt like control even if it was a small room. I left my apartment at 8 with the transparent folder in my bag and the coin envelope tucked into my wallet. And on the landing I met the concierge's niece with a bucket and a mop, and she pretended not to notice me because sometimes the safest way to show loyalty in a building like ours is to maintain a public face of neutrality. And when the elevator arrived, there was already a neighbor inside, the one from the 3rd floor who always wears sandals even in winter, and he glanced at my folder and smiled with too many teeth and asked if I was finally moving to a smaller place because the stairs are hard at our age and the flats on the other side have nicer light, and I said I was going to the bank. And he chuckled and said that his cousin had done a donation with usufruct last year and that it had been the best decision she ever made because now her children handle everything and she has no worries. And he used the word worries the way people use a spoon to stir without tasting, and I stepped out on the ground floor and thanked him for the advice and walked to the street with a speed that surprised me considering my knees complain on humid days. The branch was already open, and a line had formed at the counter under the tall glass panes, and I took a number and stood behind a woman holding a small dog with a bow on its head, and the woman turned and said her dog was nervous because of the machines. And I nodded and stared at the floor, and when my number flashed, I moved to the side desk where they handle problems with cards and addresses and other small miseries that grow into larger ones if left alone. A young man with a smooth jaw and a tie the color of toothpaste asked for my identification, and I handed him my national ID and said I needed to correct a phone number change and see the record of a power of attorney registered in my name. And his smile dimmed and he asked me to sit while he consulted with his manager, and I sat where he could not see me and watched him cross the room to a door marked private, and he disappeared and another minute passed, and then he returned with a woman whose hairstyle looked expensive and who introduced herself as the branch manager, and she led me to a small glass cubicle and offered me water, and then folded her hands on the table as if she were bracing herself. "Senora Elena, we have an update on your profile from Tuesday morning," she said, choosing her words carefully, "a power of attorney presented by your daughter-in-law to manage communications and account access, limited to administrative actions without the ability to withdraw without your consent." The mobile number was updated at the same time. "The documentation appears in order on our system." "I did not grant a power of attorney," I replied, and I watched her eyes. not her hands, and I saw a flicker that told me she had hoped I would not say that sentence, and I repeated slower. Because I wanted the words to fill the space between us in a way that could not be misunderstood, I did not sign. I did not attend a notary for that purpose, and I did not authorize a phone number change. It was accepted because the notarial copy included your identification and the witness declarations were complete, she said, and then she looked again at her screen and her posture shifted slightly. The notary seal is from an office in a district we know. I will contact them, but I need to be candid that as long as an apparent power of attorney exists, our system prevents us from reversing related changes without either revocation or a court instruction. You can add a note that I dispute it, I said, and you can restrict any further changes until I deliver a revocation or the court speaks. And you can tell me what was done with that power besides changing a phone number. A password reset for online banking was requested, and the contact email was updated. She answered, "No transfers have been executed under that authority." And a scheduled payment to the community administrator was canceled and re-entered from a different account holder name, presumably to centralize payments, but I will have to look at the movement details. I pay the community fee from my account, I replied, and I will continue to do so. Restore the domiciliation to my account now and place a hold on third-party actions until my lawyer arrives with a revocation document. I will sit here while you do it if necessary. She did not argue. She typed. She called a person in another room. She printed a form for me to sign to place a dispute flag on my file, and while I signed it, she studied my signature as if it had something to tell her that the form could not. And when she finished, she offered to escort me to the door herself, and in the lobby she paused and lowered her voice a few degrees. "I will call you this afternoon on your landline when I have confirmation that the updates are frozen," she said, "and I advise you to visit the notary who appears on the document. If there has been an error, they must correct it with urgency." "There was no error," I said. "There was an attempt to rearrange my life without asking me. If it helps you to sleep better, call it an error for now." The dog woman was back in line and she watched me with interest, and two men at the ATM glanced at me and then at each other, because people enjoy a small drama when it does not involve their own money. And I stepped into the sun and took 3 slow breaths until my knees reminded me they were attached to a body that had stood long enough. And then I walked to the bus stop and sat with my folder on my lap and my hands on top of it, as if it needed to feel I had not let go. I had time before the appointment with the lawyer, so I stopped at the community administrator's office 2 blocks away because if someone had canceled my domiciliation, then someone at that desk would have a record of a conversation they should not have had. The administrator was behind the counter with his tie loose and his shirt cuffs rolled, and he looked up with the expression of a man who expects complaints and hopes they are small. "I am here about the cancellation of the domiciliation for my community fee," I said. "I did not request it. I want to see who did." "We received a call and an email from your daughter-in-law," he said, not even pretending to check his system before answering, because he had not considered that a woman my age might ask for proof. "She said they were taking responsibility for the payments after a donation of bare ownership, and that the easiest way was to consolidate the debits under their account. She forwarded the donation draft. Congratulations, by the way. It simplifies things around here when one person handles paperwork for an entire family." "There is no donation," I replied. "There is a draft I did not sign. There is a photograph of a draft that you should not have accepted as final, and there is a tendency in this city to believe that words like simplification mean consent. Reinstate my domiciliation now. Send me the administrative log of any changes related to my property. And make a note that any requests about my account must be made by me in person or in writing from my address, not by a relative on the phone." He opened his mouth to protest that their internal policy allowed a family member to manage on behalf of an older owner if there was a donation draft and a relationship of trust. And then he thought better of it because perhaps the tone of my voice did not match the stereotype he had assigned to the hair color he could see from behind his counter. And he said he would reinstate the domiciliation and that he would print the log for me while I waited, and a woman at the other desk looked up with interest because she recognized my name from the meeting where I had questioned their reserve fund math. I took the log and paid the current month on the spot because I did not want any excuse later that would allow anyone to say I had neglected my obligations. And as I left, a man in a work shirt on a ladder glanced down at me and made a small salute with his rag, and I realized I knew him from the hallway repairs last winter, and the recognition made me feel less alone than any number of speeches could. At the lawyer's office, I was on time, and he was already waiting, which is unusual for his profession, but consistent with the way he has always treated me, and he listened while I laid out the notary at my table, the bank phone number change, the administrator log, the advanced directive copy with witness signatures, and the USB with the cryptic 1107. And he took notes in a small notebook and did not interrupt except to ask for the names of the witnesses and whether I trusted them, and I said I did not know them well enough to attach the word trust to their faces, and he nodded and said that in our jurisdiction a donation with reservation of usufruct is binding once signed, but only then. That a power of attorney must be executed before a notary and cannot be validly granted by a copy shop mailer. That banks sometimes accept a pre-notarized copy if a clerk is busy or careless. And that an advance directive requires witnesses who cannot be beneficiaries and must sign in the presence of the declarant, and his pen scratched the paper while he said that we would file a preemptive notice of potential fraud with the registry and serve a cease and desist letter to my daughter-in-law and the notary, whose name appeared on the bank system. And I listened and felt the tightness under my sternum ease a fraction, because having language was like having a railing on a staircase. There is a second track I need you to prepare for, he said, and he waited until I nodded. If your daughter-in-law intends to push an incapacity process, she will need 2 steps, a medical report and a petition to the court with supporting witness statements. Expect a sudden interest in your health. Expect an appointment that is framed as routine. Expect her to say that it is out of care. If you refuse, she gains a story. If you attend, she gains a piece of paper that can be twisted. The ethical limit is firm here, but the social pressure will not feel firm. You will need witnesses of your own and a record of your capacities in daily tasks. I have ledgers and bills and shopping lists that would make a military quartermaster blush, I said, and he smiled at the image because he also knows my habits, and he told me to begin keeping a daily log with dates and tasks and people interacted with, and to ask my parish pantry coordinator to write a letter stating that I manage accounts, and to bring the building administrator log, and to stop apologizing for taking notes, because the people who hope I won't are counting on that apology. He drafted 2 letters while I waited, one to the notary whose seal appeared on the bank record demanding copies of the power of attorney and the identity of the person who presented it, and one to my daughter-in-law, polite and precise, instructing her to cease representing that any donation or power of attorney had been executed and warning that further actions would be treated as fraud. And while his assistant printed them, he looked at the coin envelope and asked if I had a way to view the USB. And I said my grandson had set up a player on my laptop for me to watch videos of his football matches, but that I do not open unfamiliar devices without asking someone to stand with me because I have learned that technology is a field full of holes and I prefer to stick to the path when my balance is precious. He nodded and offered his office computer under supervision, and I said I wanted my grandson present when I watched it because the notes smelled like a young person's conscience, and he agreed that a witness who is not yet bitter is a good thing to have at your side. Back at home, I ate something simple and wrote in a notebook the things I had done since morning, including the names of bank staff and the time the branch manager promised to call. And I was still writing when my daughter-in-law sent a message to the family chat with a photo of a brochure for an assisted living residence with a pool, and her caption said, "Just looking at options early, no pressure. Heard they have great activities." And I stared at the pool in the photo, blue and calm, and then I scrolled and saw that my son had liked the message, but had not written a word, and my grandson had sent no sticker this time. And a minute later the intercom sounded, and when I answered, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice announcing herself as if she were a nurse at a clinic and asking if she could come up for a minute. And she did not wait for me to say yes before I heard her steps and then her knock. I opened the door, and she stood there with a box in her hands and a smile that had been calculated for the occasion. "I brought you a gift," she said, "a new phone with big numbers and an app that lets us see when you need anything and order groceries for you." We can set it up in 5 minutes, no fuss, just your thumbprint and a couple of codes, and then you won't have to press so many buttons when you call the doctor or the bank. I prefer my old phone, I replied. It rings, it calls, it does not report me to people who are not in the room. Leave the box if you like, I will think about it, but we will not set it up today. You are being difficult, she said, and the smile stayed, but her eyes cooled. We are trying to help you arrange your life so you don't fall into a mess with payments and appointments, and you are making it complicated for no reason. You always said you don't like pressing buttons. I do not like pressing buttons for someone else's agenda, I replied, and I would like you to leave, because I am expecting a call and my tea is getting cold. Your tea can wait, she said. The doctor can see you tomorrow morning for a cognitive check. It is routine after 70. They need to adjust your medications if necessary. I made the appointment because you always forget to call. I am not on any medications that require a cognitive check, I answered, and the doctor will not see me tomorrow morning because I have my own appointment. Cancel it. Do not schedule anything in my name without asking first. The doctor is doing us a favor and will fit you in at 9, she said. It would be rude to cancel now. Rude to whom? I asked. To the person who decided I cannot decide, or to the person who must give up her morning because someone else wants a file. I will call the clinic myself. She set the box on my sideboard and walked into the kitchen without asking and opened my fridge and commented that I had nothing fresh except a lemon and that this was exactly the sort of problem the app would solve. And then she closed the fridge and leaned on my counter as if this were her apartment and asked me if I understood that the donation of Bear ownership would protect me from bad actors because they could not trick me into selling my place if I no longer owned it. And she blinked as if she had come up with an argument I could not counter, and I told her that I do not need protection from strangers when my problem is someone who shares a table with me. And then I felt my phone vibrate and I saw the bank branch number, and I put my hand up to stop her talk and walked to the balcony because I wanted my voice to be clear of kitchen echoes when I took the call. The branch manager told me that she had placed a freeze on all profile changes unless made in person by me, and that she had contacted the notary, who would send copies of the documents presented on Tuesday. And she added that she had also reopened my online access codes and disabled the reset initiated at 11:19, and I thanked her and asked if she had a record of who entered the branch on Tuesday at 11. And she said that for privacy she could not say, but that if a complaint was filed, a court could request the footage, and I said I understood, and that my lawyer would do what was necessary. And I ended the call and turned to find my daughter-in-law leaning in the doorway with her arms crossed and an expression I have seen her use on waiters who bring the wrong sauce. You are making everyone's life harder, she said, and for what? Pride. Old paperwork habits. Do you know how this looks to people? They think we are neglecting you if we don't take charge. The administrator said as much to me. The neighbors talk. Let them talk, I said. I can endure gossip better than I can endure theft dressed up as help. That is an ugly word, she said, and you should not use it with family. Then you should stop creating situations where it fits. She lifted the phone box as if to take it back and then set it down again, undecided, and then she chose a different tactic because she is good at trying doors until one opens. Your grandson worries, she said, and her voice dropped into a softer register. He sees the bills and the meetings, and he thinks you carry too much. He asked us to take on the community fees so you could rest. He is a kind boy. You should not punish him because you hate me. I do not hate you, I answered. I dislike the way you move other people's money around and call it love. And if you use the boy's concern as a lever again, I will treat it as a separate problem. You cannot threaten me, she said, straightening. You will need me more than you know in the next months. Memory goes in steps. People slide without noticing. I am trying to prepare the ground so the landing is soft. I will be fine, I said, and if I am not fine, I will say so, and I will choose who stands beside me. Right now it is not you. She left with a flounce she probably thought looked theatrical, but in our small hallway looked childish, and after she shut the door I sat down and wrote in my notebook that she had tried to schedule a doctor, that she had brought a phone with an app, that she had used the boy's name as cover, and I wrote the time because I want a judge to see that my memory can trap numbers without slipping. The afternoon brought a new front. The building administrator posted a notice in the lobby about a special meeting to approve repairs to the elevator. And 2 hours later my neighbor with the sandals knocked to ask if I would sign a proxy so he could vote on my behalf because it would make things faster, and I told him I would attend in person. And he laughed and said that I am stubborn and that the votes never change and that the administrator and my daughter-in-law had already aligned the numbers, and I closed the door gently and added his sentence to my notebook, and when the meeting began at 7 the administrator tried to rush through the agenda. And I raised my hand and asked about the quotes from the 3 repair companies and whether the prices included the maintenance contract or only the initial overhaul, and he said he would email the details to the owners who managed the accounts. And I said he would email them to me, and my daughter-in-law, who had appeared just before the start with a stack of papers, frowned and whispered to him, and he corrected himself and nodded at me like a schoolboy caught with someone else's homework in his bag. A neighbor in the last row muttered that old people should not make simple things complicated, and I turned and looked at him until he lowered his gaze to his shoes. After the meeting, the concierge's niece handed me a folded note that someone had left at the desk without leaving a name. And the note said in cramped handwriting that the woman who lives 2 floors up had been asked to sign as a witness for a paper stating that I could not manage my affairs, and that she had declined because she had seen me correct the administrator's math last month and believed me more than any rumor, and I stood with the note in my palm and felt something that was not relief exactly, but something like proof that the world tilts toward the sensible when enough people are tired of being embarrassed. When I came back to my apartment, there was a brochure under my door for the same assisted living residence my daughter-in-law had messaged, only this time someone had circled the phrase, "Guardianship support available," in blue pen. And below the circle there was a handwritten price for the deposit that made my jaw tighten, and I put the brochure next to the phone box on the sideboard and went to make tea, and while the kettle rumbled my son called and I answered because avoiding him had its own cost. "She told me you were rude," he said, not greeting me, as if that would prevent the conversation from being anything but an argument. "She said you threw her out when she is just trying to help. She tried to install a surveillance app and schedule a doctor to write a report that could be used to declare me incompetent." I replied, "She calls it help, and I call it a staged photo for a petition." "You think the worst of her always," he said, "and it is exhausting." "I think based on evidence," I said, "and it is exhausting to carry the evidence while my own son refuses to lift a page." "You dramatize," he said, and then he lowered his voice, perhaps because he was in the car with her. "You will sign the donation next week, and this will calm down. It is a matter of time. You are making a storm out of a draft. If you push a draft hard enough, it becomes a weapon," I said, "and I will not sign anything while the bank lists a power of attorney I did not grant and the administrator accepts emails from you as if you were me." "You must trust me," he said. "I am your son, and I have never taken a cent from you without asking. You do not have to take it if the paper moves it for you." He breathed loudly into the phone, and I could hear my daughter-in-law's voice in the background telling him to end the call, and he did. And my tea went cold while I stood at the counter looking at the peeling edge of the brochure on the sideboard and the USB coin envelope on top of my notebook. At 10 that night there was a knock again, softer this time, and when I opened the door my grandson stood there with his backpack and his face set in a way that told me he had decided to do something that might cost him. And he slipped inside and closed the door and went straight to my small table and took the coin envelope and held it up like a baton. "I know who wrote the note," he said, "but I will not say yet because they asked me not to, and I gave them my word. And I wanted to bring my laptop so you could watch it here because if anything happens later I want to be able to say I saw you watch it and you understood it and you were not confused." "You are braver than your parents," I replied, and he shrugged and shook his head because he did not want praise, he wanted action, and he opened his laptop and inserted the USB and clicked through folders until a video with a timestamp appeared. And he pressed play and we watched the entrance of the bank on Tuesday at 11 o'clock, and there was my daughter-in-law walking in with her hair neatly tied and a folder in her hand, and behind her was a neighbor from the second floor who smiled at the security guard, and then the camera flicked to a desk where my daughter-in-law sat and opened the folder and presented a document to a clerk, and the camera had no sound, which only made the gestures louder. And then the clerk stood and walked away with the document, and my daughter-in-law pulled out her phone and typed a message, and my grandson paused the video on the moment her screen lit up and zoomed enough that we could see the preview of a text to my son that said, "Step 1 done. Number change next," and then he continued, and we watched the neighbor sign something on a pad, and then the clerk returned and shook my daughter-in-law's hand, and at 11:07 the clerk led her to another desk and pointed at a screen. And my grandson froze the image again and looked at me. "The note writer works near the security desk," he said. "They say there are internal cameras at the counters too, but this is the one they could copy fast without getting caught. They say the internal video can be requested by a judge if we file a complaint. They say you should act before she files anything at court, because then it turns into a different process and is harder to stop. Your note writer will be a witness," I said, "and my lawyer will love this." "There is more," he said, and he fast-forwarded to 11:19, and we watched my daughter-in-law step out of the branch and send a voice note. And then the camera outside caught my son walking toward her from the corner and taking the folder from her hand and kissing her cheek, and my grandson paused it again because he is 17 and there are moments he does not want to see made into proof. "I love him," I said, because it was a fact I could not delete even if it was inconvenient, and I will treat his actions as misunderstanding until he proves otherwise. "He knows," he said. "I have heard enough to know he knows. He is not leading, but he is not stopping her." We watched the rest in silence until my grandson closed the laptop and asked if he could sleep on my couch because he did not want to go home and pretend to be blind. And I said yes, and I pulled a blanket from the cupboard and laid it out and brought him a glass of water and turned off the main light so that the room could look less like a stage, and he stared at the ceiling and said that when he was little he thought adults always stared better. And now he just hopes they don't accelerate at every corner, and I told him he was allowed to be disappointed in us sometimes, and he rolled to his side and fell asleep faster than I believed possible. In the morning, I woke to a certified letter stuffed under the door because our postman is lazy with the slips, and the envelope had the bank's logo in the corner and a serious weight. And I brewed coffee first because if I was going to open a new trouble, I wanted caffeine nearby, and then I slit the top carefully and pulled out 2 pages and a brochure. The first page was a formal confirmation of changes made to my profile, pursuant to presentation of a valid power of attorney executed before Notary X on date, listing the updated mobile number and email, and a request for replacement of the specimen signature, scheduled for next Tuesday at 10, and the second page was a notice of a scheduled debit to a third-party account for a residential deposit at the assisted living residence whose brochure had been tucked in, the debit to occur in 48 hours, flagged as pending customer signature to authorize exception to dual authorization rule for accounts with limited POA. The line that took my breath came in small print at the bottom. If no objection is received by close of business tomorrow, this exception will be presumed granted under the terms of the presented power of attorney. I held the letter so firmly the paper bent, and my grandson walked into the kitchen rubbing his eyes, and I handed it to him, and he read and looked at me and did not speak because he understood that speaking would not make the letters fade. And then my phone buzzed with a message from my daughter-in-law that said, "Big day tomorrow. Let's meet at the bank at 10 so we can finalize everything," and a second message followed from an unknown number that matched the last 4 digits the bank had. Read to me, saying, "We also need your ID copy. Don't worry if you can't find it. They can scan mine for now." I put the letter on the table next to my transparent folder and my notebook, and I took my landline and dialed my lawyer's number. And while the call rang, I thought that people like to say everything can be fixed later. And then you find a sentence in small print that says later belongs to someone else, and then his voice came on the line and I read him the letter, and he did not waste seconds on outrage or scolding, and he said, calmly, that we would file for an immediate injunction that morning and deliver it by hand to the branch and the residence, and that I should not answer any messages from my daughter-in-law until he was beside me, and that if she came to my door I should not open it unless my grandson was present with the USB ready. And then the doorbell rang, and I looked at the intercom and saw my son's face under the smudged glass, and he pressed the button as if he had a right to be inside before I had even moved, and the buzzer rattled again, and my grandson stood and picked up the coin envelope and my transparent folder in one hand like a person preparing to walk onto a court, and I stepped to the intercom and pressed the talk button and asked my son why he was here so early. And through the crackle, I heard him answer that they had a car waiting and that we had a lot to do before 10, and I told him I had already done enough for this morning and that he should go to his job instead of trying to manage mine. And he paused as if the pause could turn into obedience, then said his wife had cleared her schedule to support me and that I should be grateful for family help. I pressed the talk button until the red light went dark and walked back to the table because I needed my hands on paper, not on a handle. My grandson watched me and asked if I wanted him to record the next conversation on his phone, and I nodded because a record without an audience is easier to deny than a record with a witness and a timestamp. The buzzer sounded again, long presses like a child misusing a bell, and I did not answer. I called my lawyer and said they were outside, and he said he was 10 minutes away and that I should not open the door until he had climbed our stairs, and I repeated his words aloud so my grandson could hear them, not because he doubted me, but because he needed the relief of a phrase that sounded like a rule. When my lawyer arrived, he did not knock. He called from the landing and asked me to open while the camera above the door recorded his face and his briefcase. And I unlocked the new lock, and we shook hands in the entrance like people who understand that greetings can also be statements. He set his briefcase on the table, removed a stack of papers with blue tabs, and slid the top one toward me. It was an emergency injunction petition with my name, the bank's name, and the assisted living residence's name, citing the letter that had arrived at dawn and the pending debit labeled deposit. He had already attached a sworn statement from the branch manager about the power of attorney being presented by my daughter-in-law and the time of the mobile number change. And he had attached a copy of my grandson's USB still showing her at the counter at 11:07 and a transcript of her message preview to my son that read Step 1 done. He asked me to sign the petition and the authorization for him to represent me at the bank and the residence, and I signed where he pointed while my grandson filmed the pages passing under my hand without any tremor. We walked out together, my grandson locking the door and pocketing the key, and found my son and daughter-in-law waiting by the elevator, their expressions prepared for a scene that would end with them escorting me to a car. My daughter-in-law smiled and said she was relieved to see I was dressed, and my lawyer said good morning with a tone that did not invite smiles and handed her a copy of the cease and desist letter he had sent yesterday and the stamped receipt from the court's inbox acknowledging it. She read the first line and tightened her jaw and asked if this was necessary, and he said it was required, and she turned to my son and said they were trying to create drama when all they wanted was efficiency. And my son avoided my eyes and said we would all feel better once the bank had updated the signatures. My lawyer pressed the elevator button and said we would meet at the branch, and my daughter-in-law said there was no need for extra people in private matters. And my lawyer replied that the matters stopped being private the moment a power of attorney was misused for a debit to a residence. We rode down in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because anything said here could turn into noise later. At the court building, my lawyer filed the petition at the window labeled Urgent Measures, and the clerk skimmed the attachments and disappeared into a back room. And after 7 minutes returned with a stamped order from the duty judge placing a temporary freeze on any change to my bank profile and any debit labeled deposit, pending a formal hearing within 7 days. The order also directed the bank to disclose copies of all documents presented on Tuesday and to maintain copies of surveillance footage from that date. My lawyer read it twice to make sure the phrasing could not be open to interpretation, then folded it into a plastic sleeve and said now we would go to the bank. And my grandson filmed me placing the order into my folder because later in stories like this people always ask where the paper was when it mattered, and I wanted to be the woman who kept her paper within arm's reach. At the branch we asked to speak to the manager in her glass cubicle, and she sat with the temporary freeze order in her hand like a doctor holding a diagnosis that had a treatment protocol attached. She called a back office number, read the order, and then asked a clerk to bring the notarial packet presented on Tuesday. My daughter-in-law arrived 5 minutes later with my son, speaking quickly to the clerk at the front about pre-booked appointments and the need to finish everything before 10. And the clerk pointed to the manager's cubicle and said there was a court order and that they would need to wait, and my daughter-in-law laughed softly at the words court order and asked if everyone had decided to play lawyer today. When the packet came to the table, the manager set it down between us and opened it carefully. And there was a color copy of a power of attorney with my name typed neatly and a signature that looked like mine if a person had traced it from a photocopy and then breathed on it until the ink wobbled. There were witness names, the same two neighbors from my building whose doors are always shut, and there was a seal from a notary office I did not recognize, and the manager produced a printed email from that office confirming that they had verified the identity with a photocopy of my national ID attached to the petition. I asked to see the ID copy, and she slid it across the table, and my grandson leaned in and pointed with a fingernail to a correctable white patch near the lower edge, where the issue date had been lifted and replaced with a recent month. My lawyer requested a certified copy of the entire packet and the email chain with the notary, and the manager nodded and sent a clerk to make the copies while she called the notary to alert them that a summons would follow. My daughter-in-law knocked lightly on the glass and asked if we were ready to be reasonable, and my lawyer opened the door and handed her a second copy of the court order and advised her not to contact the residents again, and she said he was making this ugly. And he answered that he was making it legal. We left the bank with the certified copy and walked 2 blocks to the community administrator's office because I wanted their log stamped as well, and the administrator tried to act busy until I said court order, at which point he printed the log of calls and emails relating to my account, and his assistant added the donation draft my daughter-in-law had forwarded. The draft contained the clause I had underlined with my nail on my birthday, and also contained a new paragraph giving the donees the right to represent the donor before service providers, which is not standard in any donation with reservation of usufruct. My lawyer circled it with his pen and asked the administrator why he had treated a photograph of a draft as if it were a completed deed, and the administrator said they see this all the time and that it speeds things up. And my lawyer asked for his written policy saying photographs of unsigned drafts count as completed deeds, and the administrator had no such policy. And his ears turned the red color of a person who has discovered that laziness can be written down and placed in evidence. Before noon, we reached the notary's office whose seal had been on the bank packet, a small operation with 2 desks and too many framed diplomas on the wall. The notary listened while my lawyer read the court order, then opened a file in his cabinet with my surname and produced a client card with my name written in a hand that looked nothing like mine, attached to a photocopy of my ID and a 1-page appointment log with Tuesday's date and the word authorization scribbled in the subject line. I asked who had stood before him to sign the power of attorney, and he said I had, reading my name as if the reading could make it true. And I told him I had been at the bank at 11 complaining about a maintenance fee and that his cameras or his appointment book would show he had seen someone else at that hour. He hesitated, then admitted that a clerk had processed the copy because he had been attending a wedding of a nephew, and that the seal had been applied on his return based on the clerk's assurance that everything was in order. My lawyer asked for the clerk's full name, their employment contract dates, their training records, and the office camera footage between 10 and 12 on Tuesday. The notary swallowed, looked at the court order again, and said he would cooperate fully. On the street outside the notary, my grandson tugged my sleeve and pointed across the boulevard to the copy shop whose receipt he had given me. And he said we should go there now because if there was a copy of my ID missing from my blue folder, then someone had made that copy close by, and maybe the shop had camera recordings. Inside, a board clerk said they delete footage every week unless the owner asks to save it, and the owner was in the back, and when the owner came out and saw my grandson, he nodded in recognition and said he could check. And after 20 minutes, he returned with a drive and a printout of the job number that matched my grandson's receipt. The footage showed my daughter-in-law at the counter with a sheet of paper and my passport-size photo, and the moment when the clerk scanned, then placed white correction tape on the issue date at her direction, then typed a new date on a label and pressed it over the tape, then copied the result. The owner watched the playback in silence and then printed a statement for us and signed it, adding his ID number and business stamp. He handed me the statement directly and said he did not like being used as a tool to hurt a neighbor, and his jaw looked tense in a way that meant he was angry at himself for not seeing it then. At home, we had 20 minutes to breathe before the next front opened. The building door clicked, and the concierge's niece came up with a folded paper and an embarrassed expression, and she said a process server had left a notice for me with her aunt while I was out. I unfolded the notice. It was a petition for provisional guardianship filed by my daughter-in-law that morning at 9:15, alleging confusion, mismanagement, and social isolation. Attaching witness statements from the two neighbors whose names I had seen on the advance directive copy. The hearing was set for the next day at 12:30. My grandson read over my shoulder and whispered that he knew one of those neighbors sometimes cleaned offices at night and was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of signing anything against me, but had been pressured by a friend from upstairs, who promised a favor in exchange. I asked him if he thought that neighbor would speak to us, and he said she would if the concierge's niece asked, because they share bus rides and cigarettes at the curb when shifts change. I wrote down a note to send the niece with a message and some courage money for her time, and I told my grandson to print 2 copies of the copy shop footage and the owner's statement. I called my doctor's office and told the nurse I needed an urgent capacity evaluation and a letter summarizing my current management of medications and daily activities. And the nurse said the doctor could see me at 5 if I could be there in 15 minutes and bring my pillbox, and I said I would, and I packed my pillbox and my food logs and the notebook where I had written down my daily tasks with names and times. And I took my grandson with me because a teenager's presence sometimes makes staff move faster, not out of compassion but out of the desire to empty waiting rooms. The doctor ran a cognitive screening and asked me to calculate change, interpret a proverb, remember 5 words after 5 minutes, and draw a clock with the hands at 11:10. I did the math, refused the proverb question because proverbs are traps dressed as wisdom, recited the 5 words, and drew the clock with the hands slightly thick because the pen was cheap. She wrote a letter stating that I was fully capable of managing my affairs, listing my recent coordination of bills and meetings and my accurate history-taking about the events of the last week, and she signed with her medical number and the clinic stamp. She asked if someone was trying to push me into a residence, and I said someone was pushing me into a system that makes other people money, and she shook her head and told me to return if I needed testimony. Back at home, my lawyer spread everything on my table like a war map without the romance. There was the court freeze order, the bank packet, the notary's admission of delegated sealing, the copy shop footage and statement, the administrator's log, the doctor's capacity letter, and my grandson's USB with the bank entrance footage. He said tomorrow's hearing would be short and that the judge would likely extend the freeze and dismiss any provisional guardianship once she saw the method my daughter-in-law had used to build her case. He also said that quick hearings sometimes move without air and that we needed a public moment where the story could not be reduced to sterile lines. He proposed we combine 2 scenes, the bank signature appointment my daughter-in-law had insisted on and the building's special meeting about the elevator budget. And he suggested we walk into the meeting after the hearing with printed exhibits and a few invited witnesses. I told him I did not want a theater piece, and he said we needed a place where people who had whispered would have to listen to actual documents, because shame works best under fluorescent lights when neighbors hold envelopes in their hands. At 9 p.m, the concierge's niece knocked again, this time with the neighbor who had signed as a witness on the advance directive copy. The neighbor kept her eyes on her shoes and said she had been told it was for routine health decisions and that I had already agreed, and that she had signed at my daughter-in-law's kitchen table while her friend poured wine, and that she had never stood in a room with me while I signed or agreed to anything about incapacity. My lawyer took her statement, wrote it in clear sentences, and she read it slowly and signed at the bottom. She looked at me then for the first time and said she had watched me take apart the administrator's figures last month and felt ashamed she had helped anyone treat me like a person to be moved around. I told her I would not hold her as an enemy and that shame can be turned into care if she wanted to help now. She nodded, tears gathering against her will, and my grandson brought her water without a word because this is the part of being human that does not need coaching. Near midnight, I received a message from my son asking if I could step outside to speak privately without lawyers or grandchildren, and I typed that he could come up if his wife stayed in the car, and he wrote back that she was asleep and that he would come alone. He arrived with the face of a man who realizes the road he chose has begun to slope downward. And he sat in my husband's old chair and looked at his hands and said things had gotten out of control and that he never wanted it to escalate to court and that he thought the residence deposit would secure a place for me in case of emergency and that he did not know about the copy shop details and that he had believed a donation would put the apartment in safe hands. I asked him when he had started speaking in phrases that sound like they were printed from an insurance brochure, and he did not answer. I told him there was still a path that did not involve him standing as an enemy to his mother in a courtroom, and that it required him to write a statement now on my table, saying he had not seen me confused, that he had never seen me mismanage bills, and that he had been present when his wife presented a power of attorney at the bank. He hesitated long enough that I wondered if silence would be his choice, and then he took the pen and wrote the statement in his round schoolboy letters that had not changed since I taught him to copy his homework into a clean notebook. When he finished, he asked if I would forgive him, and I said forgiveness is not the currency here, responsibility is, and he nodded and left with his head low. I slept for 3 hours because my body needed it, then woke to the smell of coffee my grandson had made, and we dressed for court. The hearing room was small, and the duty judge looked at the clock more than once because mornings there move with a metronome set by other cases, not by ours. My daughter-in-law arrived in a white blouse with a file under her arm and greeted the clerk with confidence that suggested she had practiced being the reasonable party. The judge asked for the basis of her petition, and she recited a list of behaviors that would sound worrying if anyone had not heard a single detail from me: missed calls, confusion about signatures, dependency on neighbors. Then my lawyer spoke, and he did not raise his voice. He placed exhibits on the bench one by one: the copy shop owner's statement and footage stills, the bank surveillance still at 11:07, the branch manager's letter about the phone number change, the notary's written admission of delegated sealing, the administrator's log showing a photograph of a draft treated as a deed, the doctor's capacity letter from yesterday, my son's handwritten statement. The judge's face did not change until the moment she read the copy shop owner's statement, and then her mouth tightened. She asked my daughter-in-law if she had instructed a clerk to alter my ID issue date and present a power of attorney without my presence, and my daughter-in-law said she had acted in good faith to help an elderly relative who avoids bureaucracies, and that in any case no harm had been done. The judge responded that altering identification documents and presenting notarial instruments without the principal present is harm, that attempting to debit an assisted living deposit from a disputed power is harm, and that pressuring neighbors to sign as witnesses outside the presence of the principal is harm, and she dismissed the guardianship petition with a note that any renewed attempt would be treated as abuse of the process and referred for investigation. We left the courtroom with papers stamped and a judgment tone still in our ears, and my lawyer suggested we walk the 3 blocks to the bank because the manager had promised to meet us and confirm the internal freeze removal only after a court order. My daughter-in-law trailed us, speaking urgently into her phone, and my grandson walked beside me with the USB in his pocket and the video files mirrored to a cloud account he had set up because he understands that sometimes safety is redundancy. In the manager's office, we signed the forms to restore my access and lock third-party actions, and the manager said she had been contacted by a representative of the residents who wanted to confirm the deposit, and she had told them the debit was blocked and under court review. She looked almost apologetic when she asked if I would allow her to send a notice to the bank's fraud unit, because she said it would trigger procedures I might find inconvenient later. And I told her to send it because inconvenience is a small price compared to losing your name. By evening, the building's special meeting room was full because word travels and people enjoy being present at stories that carry both money and shame. The administrator tried to start with the elevator budget, but my lawyer raised his hand and said we needed 2 minutes for an owner matter that touched the community, and the administrator attempted to refuse until 3 neighbors spoke up. One of them the man on the ladder from that morning, and the administrator relented because he likes to stay in his job more than he likes to take risks. I stood and held the folder, and for a second my knees remembered the weight of last month's shopping and sent a warning, but I saw my grandson in the back with his phone raised, recording, and the warning passed. I told the room that for weeks there had been talk of my confusion, my supposed mismanagement, and my need to be moved like furniture, and I said I would not argue with gossip, but I would show documents. I handed copies of the judge's dismissal to the first row and asked them to pass them back. Then I placed a printout of the still from 11:07 on the projector table, and the manager, who had come to the meeting at our request, connected her laptop and displayed it on the community screen. The room went quiet when the face on the still became large enough that even people in the last row could see it. My daughter-in-law stood against the wall and kept her eyes on the ceiling because the floor was suddenly unfriendly. I laid out the copy shop owner's statement and the still from his camera showing the correction tape over the ID issue date and the label pressed over it, and then I asked the neighbor who had signed as witness to walk to the front, and she did. And she read her statement about signing at a kitchen table without me present. I did not need to raise my voice because paper is loud in rooms like this. A woman from the third floor asked if this was a family fight that should be private, and I said it could have been if public services had not been used, if the administrator had not accepted a photograph of a draft, if a bank had not processed a number change based on a questionable power of attorney, if witnesses taken from our hallways had not been pressed into signing false attestations. The administrator cleared his throat and began to say he had acted in good faith, and my lawyer asked him to read the line in his policy that permits accepting photographs of unsigned drafts, and he turned pages and found none. And a few neighbors coughed softly the way people do when they taste the edge of someone else's embarrassment. When my daughter-in-law finally spoke, she tried a new version of her old tactic. She said she had made mistakes out of fear for my health, that she had only wanted to protect me from scams, that she had watched news reports of elderly people targeted by strangers, and had thought she could prevent it by centralizing my affairs. She looked around the room and asked the women there if they had ever overloaded themselves trying to care for a parent, and one woman from the second floor said caring for a parent is not forging their documents. And another said bringing a phone with an app to monitor a mother's movements is not care if the mother has said no. My daughter-in-law looked at my son then, a look that said he should rescue her, and he stood, cheeks white, and said he had written a statement for the court and would not contradict it here. And a murmur ran across the room because people were not expecting him to choose a side against his wife in public. We moved to close, but my lawyer asked for one last piece. He played the video from the bank entrance showing the moment my daughter-in-law left the building at 11:19 sending a voice note, and then the outside camera catching my son meeting her and taking the folder from her hand. And at that exact frame my grandson paused the playback because the lobby door opened and the concierge's niece slipped inside and whispered that a courier had arrived downstairs with a sealed envelope for me marked with the court's crest and urgent. I asked my grandson to bring it up, and the administrator, eager to be useful again, ran to fetch it himself. And when he returned he handed me the envelope with shaking hands, because he now understood that his own name might appear in some of these papers sooner or later. Inside was a notice signed by the same judge from the morning, giving date and time for a separate hearing on possible fraud in the presentation of notarial instruments, scheduling it for 48 hours from now, and listing my daughter-in-law, the notary, the bank clerk who processed the change, and the community administrator as persons of interest required to appear with records and internal policies for review. I read the notice aloud to the room because once a thing is public there is no use pretending it is not, and the silence that followed did not feel like relief or triumph. It felt like a room adjusting to a new weight that was finally placed in the right hands. The administrator tried to pivot back to the elevator budget, and no one wanted to talk about cables and pulleys, and people began to stand and whisper, and my daughter-in-law slipped toward the door with my son a step behind her. And she turned at the threshold and said this was not over. I said she was right, because the residents still had my name on a pending deposit request, the bank still had a fraud unit to notify, and the notary still had a clerk who needed to explain how a seal travels across a desk when the principal never enters the room. The meeting ended without a vote because any vote taken after a whistle is blown becomes a joke, and we gathered the documents and returned to my apartment, my grandson leaving the camera on until the door clicked shut because even endings need dates and times. I placed the judge's new notice next to the earlier order and told my lawyer I wanted the reading of any corrective deed to happen in a place where there are chairs and water and a clock on the wall that everyone can see. And he said the court would likely choose a hearing room with plastic chairs and a jug of lukewarm water, and I said that would be perfect, and he smiled because he understood that I was not asking for comfort. I was asking for witnesses and a clock. At 11 that night, when the street quieted and my grandson finally slept on the couch, I opened my blue folder to check that the capacity letter, the court orders, the bank copies, and the statements were all in their sleeves. And for a second my breath stopped because the USB drive with the bank footage stills was not there. I pulled out each sleeve twice, then checked the side pocket, then the pocket of my cardigan, then the drawer where I had placed the earlier coin envelope, and I did not find it. I went to the kitchen where we had set down our things after the meeting and found an empty coin envelope with the flap torn, and on the folded flap was a scribble in my grandson's hand I did not recognize as any note he had made today. Just 2 words and an arrow drawn as if the person writing had been in a hurry and maybe afraid of being seen. The 2 words were locker key. The day of the will reading arrived, and the tension was thicker than any courtroom drama I had ever watched on television. Sophia walked into Thomas's office in a sleek black dress that looked more suited for a cocktail party than a legal proceeding. Her heels clicked against the polished floor with deliberate confidence, and her manicured fingers clutched a designer bag as if it were a trophy. Lucas sat beside me, subdued, his small hand resting in mine. I could feel how tightly he was holding on, as though he already understood that this moment would decide not only my future but his as well. Thomas, seated behind his large oak desk, shuffled the documents with the precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times. But there was something different in his eyes, a sharpness that hinted at surprises Sophia clearly wasn't expecting. "Thank you for coming," he began. "We are here to read James Reynolds' last will and testament." Sophia interrupted almost immediately, her tone dripping with false composure. "Let's just get this over with, Thomas. I have appointments this afternoon." She glanced at her watch for emphasis, but Thomas ignored her completely, his voice steady as he began to read. The first pages were standard, debts settled, funeral expenses covered, a few small donations to charities James had supported quietly for years. Sophia looked bored, even annoyed, as though the entire exercise was beneath her. But when Thomas reached the section concerning the house, Sophia's posture changed. She leaned forward, her lips parting slightly, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Instead, the words that came out of Thomas's mouth drained the color from her face. "To my wife, Sophia Reynolds, I leave the sum of $20,000 to be used for her transition into a new residence of her choosing. The marital home, along with all its contents, is to pass in trust to my mother, Margaret Reynolds, for the benefit of my son, Lucas." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sophia blinked rapidly, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "There must be some mistake. That house is mine." Thomas calmly adjusted his glasses. "There is no mistake. James made his wishes very clear. The house is to remain with Margaret until Lucas reaches the age of 25, at which point full ownership will pass to him." Sophia slammed her hand on the desk. "This is outrageous. James would never cut me out like this. We were married for 10 years. Her voice shook, but beneath the indignation I caught the flicker of panic. I had seen it before in her, the moment when her control slipped, when the performance cracked and the truth bled through. Thomas, unshaken, opened a separate folder. "There is also a letter from James addressed to both of you. He anticipated that there might be objections." He unfolded the paper and began reading aloud. "My dearest Sophia and mother, if you are hearing this, it means I am gone. To Sophia, I leave enough to begin anew. But I cannot ignore the choices you have made that put our family at risk, particularly financial entanglements with Richard Harlow, which I discovered only months ago." To protect Lucas, I have ensured that my assets remain under the stewardship of the only person I trust without question, my mother. Sophia's face turned ashen. He's lying. Richard is just a business partner. But Thomas was already pulling out bank statements, signed contracts, and copies of wire transfers James had quietly collected. Each document was a blade cutting through Sophia's denials. She tried to snatch one of the papers, but Thomas moved it away with measured firmness. These were provided by James himself. He wanted everything documented in case you attempted to contest. Gasps filled the room. Neighbors who had come as witnesses exchanged looks, whispers rippled through the crowd, and even Lucas, though too young to fully grasp the details, looked up at me with wide eyes as if sensing that justice was unfolding before him. Sophia's carefully crafted image was collapsing in front of everyone. Her lips trembled, her hands shook, and for the first time since James's death, the mask slipped entirely. "You planned this," she hissed at me, her voice low but venomous. "You manipulated him." I met her glare calmly. "No, Sophia. He saw you for who you are. I only had to stand back and let the truth surface." The room went silent again, the weight of her disgrace hanging heavy in the air. Thomas cleared his throat. "Unless there are further objections, we will proceed with formalizing the transfer of the property as outlined." He tapped the desk lightly, signaling the end of the reading. Sophia slumped back in her chair, defeated, her reputation in ruins and her ambitions exposed as nothing more than greed. But just as I allowed myself to breathe, Thomas spoke again. "One last matter. James included a recorded message for Lucas, which he requested be played today." He pressed a button on a small device, and James's voice filled the room, steady, warm, unmistakably his. Lucas squeezed my hand tighter, tears streaming down his face as his father's words echoed. "My son, I may not be with you, but I want you to know that I loved you more than anything. Your grandmother will care for you as I would have wanted. Trust her, Lucas. She will never fail you." Sophia covered her face, but whether it was from shame or frustration, I couldn't tell. The rest of us sat in silence, listening to James's final gift of reassurance. It was a moment so raw, so undeniable, that even Sophia's manipulations could not taint it. And yet, as we left Thomas's office, I knew this was not the end. Sophia's pride was too great to accept defeat so quietly. Her eyes, though wet, still held a glimmer of defiance. She might have lost the house and her reputation today, but something in her expression told me she was already scheming her next move. I held the torn coin envelope under the kitchen light and read my grandson's hurried scrawl again, because the 2 words and the arrow were the only map I had. And when he woke, I touched his shoulder and watched his eyelids flutter the way they did when he was small and fell asleep during homework, and I asked him what he had done with the USB because the envelope was empty. And he sat up and rubbed his eyes and said he had split the files and moved one copy to a cloud folder and the other onto a fresh drive he placed in a locker at the metro station 2 stops away, the key taped under the coin envelope so that if anyone tried to take the USB from our table they would get nothing, and the real copy would sit where only we could find it. He told me he had done it after the meeting while I spoke to the neighbor who had signed the witness statement, because he noticed my daughter-in-law hovering near the sideboard when the room emptied, and he saw her glance at the envelope the way people look at a wallet. So he decided he would rather be called paranoid later than be called careless tomorrow. I asked him which locker, and he handed me the small brass key from his pocket and said there was a number stamped on it and that he would go with me now if I wanted, because he did not like the idea of the last copy being outside our home for longer than necessary. At the station, we walked past the ticket machines and the newspaper stand and the group of teenagers pretending not to notice the security guard, and we found the row of lockers with the painted numbers in a line. And my grandson matched the key to the door and opened it, and inside was a plain black drive inside a food bag from the sandwich shop above, the kind of bag nobody would look at twice. And we put the drive in my bag between 2 sleeves of papers, because I have learned that electronics are less tempting when wrapped in paper that looks boring, and we returned home to find my lawyer already at the table waiting with his notes open and his pen poised. And he looked relieved when the drive thumped onto the folder, because some men who carry briefcases know that the difference between winning and losing is sometimes a small object fenced by care and a teenager's common sense. He made a second mirror copy in front of us and handed it to his assistant with instructions to deliver it to the court clerk's evidence intake desk with a receipt stamp. And I watched the assistant walk down our hallway with a courier pouch and thought about all the little arms that reach into big machines to keep them moving, and I felt grateful that this time one of those arms was attached to a person who wanted to protect me. 2 days later, we were back in the courtroom under the plastic clock and the strip lights, and the judge sat at the same desk and shuffled the same kind of papers and asked the clerk to read the case title aloud, and the clerk's voice carried as she named my daughter-in-law, the notary, the bank clerk, and the community administrator as persons required to appear with records, and the row of 4 looked like a line called up for inspection at school, each with a folder held too tightly or not tightly enough. The judge asked the notary to explain the presence of a seal on a document executed without the principal present, and he admitted his clerk had processed a copy based on assurances from a woman claiming to be acting with my consent, and that he had applied the seal on his return from a family event without rechecking identity, and my lawyer handed the judge the office camera footage that showed the clerk stamping a file with a rubber seal, and the judge's expression did not change, but she wrote a note that I could see from where I sat because she did not try to hide it. She asked the bank clerk to explain the acceptance of the power of attorney and the profile changes without the principal present, and the clerk repeated a script about internal procedures and exceptional circumstances and client convenience. And the judge asked to see the procedure, not the script, and there was none, only an email from a manager at another branch that mentioned a practice to be avoided if possible, and my lawyer handed over our video stills and the branch manager's letter and the clerk's voice lost its shine as he admitted that a queue and a lack of experience had led him to accept the file. When it was my daughter-in-law's turn, she tried to speak first about love and worry and family duty, and the judge interrupted and said this was not the place for generalized feelings, and that this was where specific actions are measured. And my lawyer placed the copy shop owner's statement on the ledge along with the footage, still where the correction tape covered the ID issue date, and the typed label was pressed over it with a thumbnail, and the judge asked my daughter-in-law if she had given instructions to alter the identification copy, and she said she had only asked the clerk to improve legibility, and the judge asked the owner to step forward, and he did, and he read his statement again without stumbling. And my daughter-in-law shifted her weight and stared at the floor tiles like a student wishing the bell would save her. The community administrator tried to appear helpful, explaining that he acted with what he believed was a valid draft to anticipate changes, and my lawyer asked him to show a single line in our community bylaws allowing him to treat a photograph of an unsigned deed as authority over a living owner's account, and he could not, and the judge wrote another note and moved to the next page. When it ended, the judge issued an order that was not dramatic in sound but carried weight where it mattered, revoking any bank profile changes made under the disputed document, instructing the notary office to report the misuse to the professional college, instructing the bank to open a fraud file with the regulator, instructing the residents to remove my name from any pending admissions list, and instructing the community administrator to institute a written policy requiring owner confirmation for any account changes. She also ordered a protective measure barring my daughter-in-law from initiating any medical evaluations or administrative requests in my name for 6 months, renewable on application if needed, and scheduled a separate hearing to determine penalties and costs. After the order, people in the hallway gave me that look older women get when they have a day that confirms something heavy they have always suspected about how systems bend against them. And some of them smiled and some of them looked down because it is difficult to see a mirror of your possible future drawn without pity. And on the steps outside the building, the neighbor who had once muttered that old people make things complicated walked up and apologized without excuses, and I accepted, without speeches, because smaller correctives also belong in the balance. My daughter-in-law stood near the curb talking quickly into her phone, her words clipped, and when she hung up she looked at me, and for the first time in months there was no performance in her face at all. There was only calculation clearing out fast because it had failed to deliver. And she walked over and started to say that she had done everything for me, and I held up a hand and told her she would now do everything for herself because I would not put my name on any of her problems again. My son stood behind her looking at the sidewalk, and when I passed him I touched his sleeve, and he followed me to the shade of a plane tree where I could speak without the crowd hearing. And he asked if I would ever forgive him, and I said he could come to my apartment on Sunday with a box, because I had decided to return the spare key he had given me when he moved out years ago, and I expected him to return the spare of mine because that is how adults close a breach, and he nodded and wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand and said he would help me install a new lock anyway, and I said he could bring screws and a drill and not to talk too much while we did it. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arrived in plain envelopes and emails with case numbers, and they were not fireworks. They were administrative steps that moved slowly but never stopped. The notary office received a sanction from the professional college and a temporary suspension for delegating essential verification, and he sent me a letter that was almost an apology without saying the word. With a copy of the new checklist he had printed and taped above each desk, and I put it in my folder because I appreciate evidence of someone else changing for the better even if it came from my trouble. The bank placed the clerk on retraining, and the manager invited me to a small meeting with 3 staff members where she asked me to explain what it felt like to stand at a window and be told your phone number does not belong to you anymore. And I told them without raising my voice, and they listened without defensive smiles, and that was more valuable than the fine I later heard their headquarters paid to the regulator. The residents sent a letter withdrawing their deposit request, and a brochure with a handwritten note from the director saying I would always be welcome to visit their art class on Fridays as a guest. And my grandson laughed when he read it, and said the note sounded like the director had learned a lot of new words in a legal memo this month. The community administrator announced a new policy at the next meeting requiring owner-present confirmation for any change to accounts or representatives, and he added a sentence about verification calls and recorded consent. And then he looked at me and asked if I would serve on a small committee to oversee the implementation for 3 months. And I agreed with the condition that a tenant representative and the concierge's niece be included because I wanted someone from outside the owners circle to sit at the table, and he agreed because he has learned to avoid extra conflict now. The hearing on costs and penalties produced a modest fine for my daughter-in-law and a restitution order for the fees incurred in my lawyer's work, and she paid in installments over 6 months because the judge believed in letting people climb out rather than shoving them flat, and I accepted the schedule because I have no interest in winning on paper and losing the boy's father in the process. And my son thanked me for agreeing to terms that did not break his household, and I told him thanks. Our ode to the judge who understood that pressing down can be as thoughtless as pulling up. On Sunday, as promised, my son came with a box and a drill, and he stood in the entryway while I handed him the spare key to his place, and he handed me mine, and he looked around at the table and the blue folder and the lilies I had bought. And he asked if he could sit for a while without talking, and we sat and said nothing for a long time, and after he had eaten a plate of pasta he looked at me and said he had scheduled a counseling session at the family center for himself because he wanted to understand why he had agreed to so many steps that now looked absurd on paper, and I told him that sometimes what seems absurd on paper felt inevitable in a kitchen when the kettle is boiling and someone you love is speaking faster than you can think. And he nodded and said that sentence would keep him company when he sat in the waiting room. My daughter-in-law stayed away because the protective measure barred her from contacting me about administrative matters, and I did not miss her presence, and I did not gloat. I simply noticed that the building sounded different when my doorbell did not ring with instructions pretending to be help. I used the quiet months to do something I had not allowed myself to do in years because I kept telling myself there was no time. I enrolled in a short course at the community center on digital bookkeeping platforms because the parish pantry's paper ledger has become a collection of binders that weigh more than the cans they record. And the coordinator asked if I would help design a simple workshop for other seniors on protecting bank accounts and recognizing documents that are drafts rather than deeds. And we held the first session on a Tuesday morning when the market stalls downstairs were full of melons and tomato. crates, and 20 people came, including the woman from the third floor who once asked me to sign a proxy because he wanted a faster vote, and he took notes without looking at his phone and stayed behind to ask what a cloud backup was and how much it cost. And my grandson came at the end with pastries and connected the projector and sat in the back without speaking, and when we finished he hugged me longer than usual and said he liked seeing me at a table again with numbers in front of me, this time without anyone trying to snatch the pen. As for my will, I rewrote it with my lawyer so that the apartment will pass to my grandson with a clause that delays possession until he is 30 or until he completes a course in basic financial management, whichever comes first, with the right of use reserved to me for as long as I live or choose, and with a modest bequest to the parish pantry for replacement refrigerators because our current ones leak, and my lawyer smiled when I explained the clause because he said people will call it strict and I said people can call it prudent, and he nodded because he now knows that I am not a woman who leaves doors open for wind. One afternoon, the concierge's niece knocked to tell me she and the neighbor who had signed the witness statement had started a small group that meets twice a month to help tenants and older owners read their mail and handle online forms. And she asked if I would attend the first meeting to explain the difference between a power of attorney and an advance directive, and I agreed, because if someone had stood in our lobby a month earlier and said those words plainly, more than one person could have avoided embarrassment and stress. At the first meeting, the copy shop owner came to and apologized again for his part while showing the new sign he had posted behind the counter stating that staff will not alter identification documents under any circumstances and that any client asking for such a service will be reported to authorities, and he offered a discount on printing for the group's flyers, and the niece laughed and said the only discount we want is a promise to keep the sign up forever. The house felt like mine again, not because the walls changed, but because the papers inside the blue folder belonged to me without fingerprints I had not invited. And I moved the runner on the table back to its usual place and bought a new set of pens that glide without scratching. And I kept the small briefcase the lawyer had given me for hearings next to the wardrobe, because I have learned that comfort lies in knowing where your evidence is. My grandson sometimes stays over on Fridays, and we cook simple dinners and watch the courtyard as children ride circles on small bicycles, and he tells me about university brochures and internships and the way his classmates talk about leaving the city. And I tell him that leaving is a choice and staying is also a choice, and the good part of being young is having both choices at once. One evening in late summer, my son came by with a bag of groceries and a shy look, and he asked if I would come with him to his counseling appointment because he wanted to say something with a witness. And I agreed and sat in the chair while he told the counselor that he had failed to protect me because it was easier to let his wife steer than to accept that steering comes with blame, and the counselor asked him what he planned to do when blame came again. And he said he would choose the slower path, even if it meant fighting at home, and I watched his face while he said it and believed him enough for that day, which is as much belief as I have learned to give at once. On the way out, he said he was searching for a small flat in a different neighborhood and that he would manage his own bills without his wife's spreadsheets for a while, and I said that sounded like a plan that at least had his own name on it. The last loose end was the elevator budget that had been interrupted on the night of the meeting, and at the next assembly we reviewed new quotes and clearer contracts. And the administrator apologized for shortcuts, and the room actually listened to the numbers for once, and we voted with understanding rather than impatience. And when the men from the repair company came to start work, the man with the ladder from months ago looked at me and said it was good to see the project move without whispering, and I agreed because progress that sits on paper can feel like a trick, but progress with tools and a permit displayed in the window is the kind that holds. I do not pretend that everything has turned into a story with smooth edges, because the boy still splits his weekends between a father who is trying and a mother who is angry, and some neighbors still speak louder than they think. And I still check the lock twice at night even though my new door is solid, but the center holds where it needs to, and every morning I write the date at the top of my notebook and add 3 lines of tasks and 3 names I spoke to, and when I close it in the evening, I feel like I have kept my own account for another day. If you had asked me months ago what revenge looked like, I might have said something about making someone feel what they made me feel, but now I think it looks like keeping your name attached to your life and making the people who tried to detach it sign receipts that say they were wrong. On the last day of the committee's work, the administrator handed me a certificate of thanks printed on heavy paper with the community seal, and he looked nervous, as if he thought I might refuse it. And I took it and told him it would not hang on my wall but would live inside my blue folder because the real award is the written record that policies changed, and he laughed with a relief that made him appear younger. And the niece clapped, and the neighbor who had signed the witness statement brought a bag of oranges from the market, and we sat in the lobby with juice on our fingers talking about normal things like water meters and the new family in 3B. And the building felt like a place where people live instead of a stage where someone is always watching for someone else to slip. Before I go to bed, I sometimes think of the night the envelope slid under my door and the note that said, "Cameras see more than people think," and I picture the hand that wrote it, hesitant and brave in the same stroke. And I hope that person knows that their small act was the hinge on which a lot of doors turned. Once a week, I bring a paper bag to the coffee shop owner with a slice of tortilla from the bar on the corner, and he jokes that I am policing his counter with food, and I tell him I am feeding his conscience so it does not get hungry again. And he laughs and taps the sign that says identification is never altered, and we move on with our day. When I blow out my candles next year, I will invite fewer people, and there will be no notary at the table, and I will buy lilies for myself again because they make the room smell clean. And I will place the blue folder on the chair next to mine, not because I fear another folder will be opened against me, but because I like to keep nearby the papers that prove I looked after what was mine. If any of this reaches someone who is sitting at a table with a pen pushed toward their hand and a voice saying it is all for their own ease, I hope the image that stays is not of a courtroom or a fight in a lobby, but of a small teenager sliding a key across a table and a grandmother placing a document pocket between her palms until it stops shaking, because that is where the whole thing turned. I will leave you with a question that keeps me steady when my hands remember their tremor. When someone says they are helping you, is the help moving toward you or away with your name? And if you do not answer that question now, who will answer it for you when the phone number on your account stops being yours?